We made a big transition to cut the media cords so that unhealthy influences were not coming into our kids, especially as they were reaching the ages of 8, 10, 12, where it's not just the silly cartoons, but actually directed infiltration of a different worldview than a biblical worldview. Throwing the TV out was something that we said, hey, we need to be very cautious in our regard to what's coming into the home. But yes, it's going to require more time and effort and work on our part to make sure that we have healthy things that our kids are engaged in.
Welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host Jonathan Brush, and with me is our co-host and producer, David Rethemeyer. So, David, we just had a chance to finish a conversation with Brian Jacks for one of our Extraordinary and Ordinary profiles, and those are profiles of folks who, to be honest, are not necessarily world famous or necessarily the kind of people that you're going to be in the covers of magazines, and yet we know from various places that these folks are just hugely influential, and they do work that maybe doesn't get a lot of recognition outside of where they are, but has massive impact where they are right now. And our theory is that that's actually what really changes the world. And my experience with Brian, and hopefully you'll hear this in the conversation, is that Brian is a pretty big world changer and has a pretty massive sphere of influence in terms of the work that he does. And maybe it's surprising that you haven't heard him yet.
Yeah, and I would just encourage anyone who's listening coming into this that this discussion revolves a lot around parenting, but if you are not a parent or you don't see yourself becoming a parent anytime soon, I think this is still a discussion that is worth listening to because, for one thing, there's a good chance that you will become a parent if you're not yet, and so there might be some things that are helpful for you, but also, I think that he touches on a lot of things that can be applied to not just parenting, but a lot of other areas of life, regardless of whether you are a parent yet or not. So I'll offer that encouragement for anyone who might be curious as to whether or not a podcast where two fathers are talking about parenting will be relevant to them. I would encourage you, yes, this is worth your time.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's an interesting kind of coaching to the norm here. And there's all kinds of weird stuff in the culture and in the kind of odd subculture, David, you and I inhabit sometimes, where it's like, well, that's the norm, it's not the norm, and blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. And so here's the thing. I mean, statistically, most of y'all who are listening to this are parents and will be parents. And so it's worth finding out how to do that well. It's also true that if you're not, that no way changes your status as super important child of God. But you do have a staked interest in how well other people parent folks. Because they're the folks you got to be working with and for and hiring and all those kinds of things. And so in that sense, it's not that parenting is more important than anything else, or it's the only way to do things, or it's the only path that is to be blessed by God. It's just that, it holds center stage because it's important. It is how we prepare and launch the next generation. And so, yeah, if you're a young person listening to this, I encourage you to hang on. And I think not so much because it's like, this is how you should parent. It's not that kind of a conversation, but because I hope it's very encouraging. I'm just telling you, you cannot be around Brian and not be excited about being a parent, whether you are one or not. He is one of the most joyful, happy people I know. And he's also one of the most ambitious in terms of just the goals he sets and things that he does. And I've known him long enough to watch those ambitions come to fruition in some really interesting and fascinating ways. And so I hope you enjoy this conversation we had with Brian Jacks. Brian Jacks, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. It is an absolute honor for me to have you here so I can introduce you to the audience. Brian is, for me, first and foremost, a friend, and maybe I could even say a mentor in the sense that we are on kind of a parenting journey together, and there's so many things that I have learned and have watched Brian do that I'm like, I should pay attention to that. He's inspired me. Brian is many things. He's a phenomenal and high-performing professional. He is a member of a church. He's a leader in his community. But I know him most and primarily, and I suspect Brian wouldn't feel too bad if I said it this way, as a fellow dad, a father of 8 children, whom I have a colossally high respect for, every one of them. He's actually, I benefit. So I liked Brian before, so just so everybody should know this. But I really like Brian every day now because every day at Unbound, I benefit from Brian's parenting abilities because 2 of his children work for us. One in admissions and one runs our logistics department. And now a daughter-in-law also works for us. And so we have the presence of the Jacks family daily in Unbound, and it is certainly a huge asset. And to some extent, Brian, even this podcast wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for some of your children's work and effort. In addition to all those things, Brian and his family are absolutely essential to our National Student Conference Apex. And for the last several years, they have selflessly come up, spent time and treasure to be with us, have worked their hearts out at every aspect of that event. And when I say all of them, I mean Brian and his wife Amy and every one of their 8 children are just an essential part of our staff, and to the point that it's almost terrifying to think about running Apex without them. So that's the background. Brian, thank you so much for being here on the podcast. I appreciate your time.
It is a delight. And let me say that anytime any of the Jack's children hear anything about an opportunity to hang out with the Brushes, it is 100%, big advocacy effort begins here in the home for us to make sure that our calendars align. And I tell you what, with a family that's much like yours, Jonathan, that family calendar becomes a real, tipping
Yes.
point of what are we going to do and who gets what and how do we manage the operation. But it's been an absolute delight to be part of Apex. And we're certainly proud of our children, the students that are helping Unbound day in and day out, because we believe in the work that you're doing.
Well, it is fun, and I think, Brian, certainly a huge blessing for me has been able to watch friendships develop between our children, and so
Yes.
it's been fun. There's several of them who correspond in ages, and although that doesn't always make such a big difference. And yes, same thing here. The dates are circled when we know the Jacks are going to be in town. So I had several topics, and we might go all kinds of places with this, but let me start by sharing kind of a quick personal story, and then I'll tell you how that relates to you, Brian. I Without getting into the full details, when I got married, I had a very specific plan for my life and our life as a married couple. And it involved making enough money to buy what I thought was going to be our dream home and our little farm and all this kind of stuff. And 1 year and 2 months after we were married, we had our first child. And I was not happy about that development. And that's an ugly thing to say, and I feel like there's a bit of a public confession that's necessary when I do say it, and I do tell it in stories because it was a wrong attitude and it was a wrong thing to do, and it came out of just bad ideas, and there's no excuse for that, and so I'm not looking for any excuses. But I tell people something as close to magical as I can describe happened is that when we held our daughter and when I held her the first time in the delivery room, all those doubts and honestly, all those frustrations and fears that I'd had vanished instantly and permanently in that fraction of a second. And I can honestly tell you they have never returned in any form. But with that came this really deep desire at first it was kind of a desire to have my cake and eat it too. I wanted to have this kind of exciting life. And then I was like, well, I'm not going to let a kid stop me. And then it matured, thankfully, into something a little bigger and richer and deeper than that, which was I started to understand that having a family was the most interesting and exciting adventure that I could go on. Now, that was not an idea that I was smart enough to come to myself. I discredit that to the gifting and the blessing of the Holy Spirit. But I will tell you that idea has been formational in my life, and it has absolutely transformed my satisfaction, my parenting, my satisfaction with life, and has just paid endless blessings. I say that because, Brian, you were one of the few people, and there's others, but they're one of the few people that from the moment I met you, I was like, here's a guy who thinks the same things and is 10 times better at than I am. And just in terms of really excited about it, passionate about it. And so I have watched you lead your family and be a dad to your kids and do that in a grand adventure. And I just, I was thinking about this just so the audience knows. I've been backpacking with Brian and various members of his family, camping with them in several different locations with the entire family. Went to an absolutely spectacular shooting event that Brian put on a year or so ago. Was really sorry that I missed it recently when he did it again. I've watched Brian take his entire family on really adventurous cross-country trips. I have seen him go with parts of his family on international trips, including pretty recently. And of course, he brings the entire family to Apex, which is, we live in Virginia and Apex is up in Michigan. So those are just a small sample of the kinds of things they're doing. But Brian, if you could speak to that a little bit, this kind of this sense of the adventure of having a family.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate you mentioning it. And it is a grand adventure. Not that every day is great and
Right.
full of highlights and that every day is easy, far from it. But truly, I do believe that it is something that I've been called to do, my wife and I, as you have, and that most people, again, as I think about Unbound students, should be preparing for that goal. And as you pointed out, writing out goals and coming up with a game plan for one's life as a college student about to be married or a young married person, I do think that that is important and wise. At the same time, recognition that we grow in wisdom as we get older, and so our goals and plans do change. So I think that the idea as parents, my hope is that I've trained up my children with a foundation, a biblical foundation that is allowing them to set their sights on goals that are more aligned with God's word than was with mine at those early ages and stages. And I'm thankful that Unbound, I believe, is a huge component of the development of that sense of what am I all about? What's my purpose? How do I play into the community that God's placed me in? And in what ways am I going to be a good steward with the time, talents, and resources He's given me to achieve what He has put forward in my life and what is to come?
So, Brian, I've watched you parent your children and adjust for each one of those in ways that I think are pretty unique. And so I'm just thinking, I've watched you parent a child that had business and entrepreneurial skills. I've watched you parent a child that had interest in rescue squad and local kind of criminal justice things and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I've watched you parent a child that is really into creative stuff and video editing and creating videos and those. And it's always struck me that you have, it's one thing, all parents to some extent ought to recognize and sort of, appreciate the gifts of their children. But I've seen you again and again go out of your way to really go beyond and providing them tools and opportunities to kind of grow those gifts. I've really respected that and I've learned a lot from watching that. Just curious, like, is that a kind of pick it up as it comes along thing? Is there a plan behind that? Or tell me a little bit about that. Because I've seen you do that specifically for your children, calling out some unique gifts. Sometimes those gifts are very different in each of those children.
Very
And I
different.
think you're really good at that. So tell us more
Yeah.
about that.
Well, thank you. I will just reiterate that you are right, that we have children who really show musical aptitude. We have one or more that are extremely academic. Others, as you've mentioned, are much better with verbal communication than written communication. Different ages and stages and processing through the scholastic adventures. Thankful for homeschooling, giving the opportunity to home educate in a way that recognizes each child's different. And they may be in, ninth grade in math, even though they're typically would be seen as a third grader and are doing reading at a third grade level or different, components of that educational process. Our real Amy and I, my terrific wife, we've been married for more than 25 years. A big part of it is making sure that we have set down goals and expectations for our children, recognizing that each one is different, but we've outlined what we call our family legacy goals, which is a sense of God's calling on our lives as parents, Amy and I. And I'm just going to read a few components of that as we're talking today. But here's the bottom line, that we are committed to glorifying God through worship, service, and stewardship, using the gifts, talents, and resources that He provides to produce maximum impact for the kingdom of Christ. And what is that impact? Well, in some cases, it's our boys helping our neighbors put up fencing for their cattle or for their goats. And in other cases, it's individuals putting out, again, young students, young children here, putting out a weekly encouragement call, recording a 2-minute message that includes a Bible verse, a piano song, a prayer that goes out and people listen to that and are encouraged every Tuesday at 10 o'clock. We have, again, just each of us, God has given us with different abilities and talents. And so we use that in the workplace, within our church family, with our neighbors living nearby us, and with neighbors overseas. Some of our children are very engaged in missions and unique in different ways. And so Amy and I take a very serious responsibility of helping to guide our students as they are in the learning process. And of course, also giving them a strong biblical foundation right from the start so that that's their motivation, not I'm looking for the world's definition of success, more and more riches, fame, power, but instead, how is it that when I get to the end, that I can be seen as one who is following God's plan for my life and using that time wisely?
Just a quick note on your encouragement call. I happen to be on the encouragement call list. and it comes in. Generally, I have a meeting scheduled at the same time, so it's fine. It goes to voicemail, but it always makes me smile because it pops up and it's on a service I guess you use that calls multiple numbers at once, and so it pops up, and my phone always says likely home services. And I always, I always get a kick out of that. I was like, it is home services. It's services that start at home and it's servicing people at my home. And it's always fun for me because I have a busy day of meetings the day that comes in. And so I generally, at the last meeting, the first thing I do is pick up the phone and listen to the Jack's encouragement call, often calling my younger children in because they want to hear the younger Jacks typically do it. The younger Jacks on that. And so it's a fun ministry. So
Thank you.
I,
Yeah. And and I just want to, again, showcase that as parents, our goal is to get our kids engaged in ministry, evangelism, service from an early age. And I'm thankful that in a lot of what we're doing, whether it's a food collection or helping out to clean the church or engage in teaching of some sort, as much as we can involve our children at early ages and then handing over the reins and allowing them to actually lead projects that are making a difference in our community. That's exactly what we're attempting to do as we're building family unity and mutual support, as we're training up ongoing generations of faithful disciples.
so as you were talking about this, I had an odd thought, Brian. And so you have to bear with me a little bit as I say this because,
Sure.
and I want the audience to know this thought came from my own experience, not something I witnessed on Brian's side. That's an important caveat that'll make sense here in a second. So, Brian, when you say what you say, I have seen that lived out in your life, and I've seen the fruit of that in your children. So I just want the audience to know this is not an idle boast, and this is not an aspirational goal, although it certainly is an aspirational goal, but it's an aspirational goal that I've seen Brian and Amy lead their children on and achieve large portions of it. And of course, we never achieve all of it. That's why they're aspirational goals and all those kinds of things. So there's an authenticity here that I can personally speak to. I will also say, I was thinking about if I'm in the audience. Brian, I've sat in family conventions and homeschool conventions, and I've listened to people talk, and I'm like, man, that is not my family. And I don't mean that in a way that's disparaging to my family. I just think that at one point, I had very young children. I was going to these things, and there's people on stage saying, their kids spoke Greek and learned sign language, and they were doing all these things. I'm like, that's fantastic. And, a couple years later, I was like, I'll be happy if they're not incarcerated as juniors, like that we could do. And so, and by God's grace, there's lots of things I can now point to and say, man, I'm really proud of my kids.
Yes.
And we've had really just a lot of blessings upon us. But I often, as I look back, I think less and less about what I've done that was right, and more about the things that I've really failed at
Hmm.
and the lessons I've learned from that. And I'll give you an example. And that's why I was saying earlier, I actually have not seen this example in Brian's life. So I'm using a personal example here, but I remember very distinctly that several years ago, one of my daughters was under the age of 10, and she was a more sensitive child than some of her older two siblings. And something happened, and I grew up in a loud family. It's not code for an abusive family. I just grew up in a family with two boys and two parents, and they were very expressive. And so there was shouting and carrying on, not berating, not a abusive type of thing, but communicating in higher volume was a normal thing to us. My wife's family is very quiet. And so this particular daughter inherited sort of the quiet aspect of things. And whatever happened, she said something or did something, and I turned around and shouted at her. I was not actually mad. I remember distinctly that I was not upset with her. It was kind of for me, a natural expression. But in my mind, even though this is not the literal image of it, in my mind, I remember seeing her just fly into pieces. Like I saw her just shatter. Like I'd never seen the impact of my words hit home so badly. And I recognized in an instant that I had done a great amount of damage there. Even though, again, I was not angry. It wasn't actually a shout of anger. It was just the way it expressed it. And so I got in my arms and apologized. And I don't know if it fixed that thing for her, but it certainly in one instant completely transformed my parenting. In other words, I have almost, and I didn't become a quiet person overnight, but there is a pretty bright, shining, fiery line between that moment and everything that happened afterwards in terms of my shouting at my children, which is not to say I've never done it again, but that it was a whole different deal.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you've got a lot of parental experience, more than a lot of people. And so this is a funny question to ask you, and it's a bit of a vulnerable question, but can you think of a lesson that you learned from kind of stepping off the wrong side of the cliff, that didn't work, that ended up being really influential to you? And again, I wanted to frame that up to say, I don't ask that because I actually witnessed that. I was just thinking about it
Right.
personally and wondering about how your perspective on that.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for, again, asking an open question that's realistic and makes sense, and kind of a sense of, hey, what's one thing that I've experienced or had an aha moment with and said, oh, I really need to make sure that I'm incorporating that a little bit better
Yeah.
into daily life. Again, just a few things as I think about our progression as families. And I will say that one of the big changes occurs when your students, when your kids are growing and passing through different stages of life. So, when we were initially trying to manage 5 kids under whatever ages they were at the time, I know that in reality, we used quite a bit of media to help make sure that certain kids were getting what they needed over here while allowing us to focus over here. I'll say that one thing that we made a big transition when we came from the Richmond area to the Roanoke area. And a component of that was to cut the media cords so that unhealthy influences were not coming into our kids, especially as they were reaching the ages of, you know, 8, 10, 12, where, it's not just Blues Clues or, silly cartoons, but actually, much more, directed infiltration of a different worldview than a biblical worldview. So I'll mention that that's something as a parenting choice of throwing the TV out was something that we made when we got here to Roanoke and said, hey, we need to be very cautious in our regard to what's coming into the home. Even though, yes, it's going to require more time and effort and work on our part to make sure that we have healthy things that our kids are engaged in. I'll say that in terms of parenting style or things that I'll say that one of the things that I lacked in the early years that we are committed to now and have been again since Beijing, I should mention that our family made a pretty large move from suburbia of the capital city of Virginia, Richmond, in a neighborhood surrounded by homes and paths and beautiful sidewalks and that kind of thing, to transitioning out to the middle of nowhere in rural Virginia, Bedford County. And that was not, by accident. I will say that Amy at that time, which was 2012 or thereabout, was saying, hey, Brian, I don't know how many kids we had exactly then, but a bunch of them. And say, hey, we need to make sure that we have a real clear vision for what it is that we're doing. If God continues to bless us with children, again, it's hard to explain the workload and what is required to provide for your family. I mean, work wise, plus be a discipler, plus, again, loving your wife, again, trying to make sure that we're keeping those priorities in order. And so Amy was asking, hey, what is the vision here? What are we trying to do? And without going into the fullness of it, prayerfully, with the help of mentors and wise advisors, a sense of, hey, we need to make a family change in location if possible to enable us to be unified. One of our missions is, again, in the legacy goal document that I have that I'm happy to share with others, is to build up family unity and mutual support, that we're working, daily together. Deuteronomy, sharing God's truths as we rise up, as we lie down, as we walk along the way. And when I was, taking the trip into the Capitol, working in a skyscraper in downtown Richmond for most of the day, and then trying to be a discipler, a facilitator, a teacher in those, brief moments before I left for work and in the evening, I'll let you know, it just wasn't enough. It was not adequately loving my wife, and it was not adequately discipling my children. So we moved out here to a property where we now have lots of room to run, the ability to engage our children in all sorts of different tasks and chores and to learn by doing. We can get into the entrepreneurial thing at some point if you'd like, but to, really take it upon myself as a dad to be seeing what's going on in the house throughout the day, not just hearing a report from my wife at the end, but being involved. And when discipline is needed, that I'm available. When coaching is needed, I'm available. When there's a aspect of home education that I can help with, that I'm there. And I will say that I wish that I had incorporated that earlier in the overall process of raising up our kids and, again, caring for my wife in a way that the book of Ephesians would align my responsibilities as a father. Because if you're not loving your wife, you're not being a good father either. There's no way that you can do that one, raising up your kids in a loving way without caring for one's wife. So that's a key priority for me.
I think there's a component there that will strike some people as maybe odd, Brian. Maybe you can expound on a little bit. Is that if I run that back and tell that story, I think what you said is that, and you didn't put it quite this way, but you had a great house in a beautiful neighborhood and a
Yes.
high prestige job in a skyscraper. You didn't say the high prestige part, but generally they come with that if they're in a skyscraper. And you made a move, and possibly, you didn't mention this, but possibly a career move, but you made at least a physical move based not on career, but on what you thought was ultimately best for your family. I think that most people don't think about making career moves. I mean,
Yeah.
don't think about making moves based on that. I mean, I would say 99% of the people I talk to, I moved because of a job, moved
Right.
because of an opportunity, something like that. But you're kind of saying the opposite there, which is I deliberately and specifically chose to relocate for something that had nothing to do with career path and everything to do with family path. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. I want to be very clear in saying that God paved the way. So thankful for the answer that he gave to our prayers. Again, Amy and I coming together, attempting to map out, hey, what does God want us to be doing? How do we best steward the resources he's given us, which includes time, and the idea of racing back and forth 30 minutes one way to work and back and spending the day away from the family was a big obstacle to the discipleship. So in terms of how much to say about that, I will let you know that my role did not change that much. I was thankful to have a boss that said, you know what? If you're willing to take a different area, responsibility for a different area of the state, you could do what you're doing now in a different location and being able to work from home. This was well before any of the work at home trends that we've seen
Mhm.
as of late. And we really feel like that God opened those doors and made it work such that it was a win for the company that I worked for, as well as a win for the family. And I will say that I'm thankful to have a job that oftentimes my children are engaged in. It deals with nonprofits and service. And I won't go too far into that, but just a sense that when I'm dealing with volunteer efforts and can incorporate my family in that volunteering, it's a win-win. It's a win for those that are reporting to me. It's a win for accomplishing the objectives that my work has set for me. And it's also a chance for growing the maturity of my children, which you're now experiencing as you're working
Yeah.
alongside of some of them because they've been in a corporate environment or a work environment at the very earliest stages, seeing the planning and execution of projects, service projects mainly, and that helps us grow children that are mature and prepared for life at an early age. And that's part of our goal. Amy and I, as we're attempting to parent, we want to make sure that our children are mature and prepared for life to lead, to serve, and to be a good steward of their time, talents, and resources.
So, Brian, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about those listening. So, if you're a parent listening to this, I think there's a temptation to come back to. Just a quick note: if you're a young person listening to this, to some extent, this is your future if you have a family. I mean, you'll be facing some of
Yeah.
these same decisions and questions. I'm tempted to take one conclusion out of this, which is if you want to have adventures with your family, you have to plan for the family first, and that's kind of an aspect of it. And you're kind of saying that. There's something else though that I want to. I'm thinking about people listening to this, and I think that sometimes there's a knee jerk reaction listening to that and say, "Well, that worked fine for you, buddy. You must have had a great boss and a great situation." Oh, that's lovely that you can work from home and incorporate your children and all this kind of stuff, but and then insert whatever the situation is. There is a bit of sometimes in certain circles, there's this idea that your family is more important than whatever you do for your work. But that's never what I've learned or observed from you. And the one thing that I kind of react to that myself personally is like, well, no, actually, setting a good work example is one of those important things you can do for your family. And so I know that the reason, and you're not stating it for obvious reasons here, the reason that you were able to do what you did started primarily because you were excellent at what you did. And I wonder if you can talk about that. There was a previous experience and a previous investment in excellence that offered you the opportunities to do something that people would say, well, that sounds like a great deal. It might be a great deal. And certainly there was, everything is guided by God. And so we'll count that as a blessing. At the same time, it was a great deal that was possible because of investment and excellence that you put in. So I don't know if you could speak to that and
Great.
kind of the
Oh, I'm
excellence part
happy
of it.
to share a bit. And again, I appreciate you mentioning that, hey, God's in charge in terms of whether he blesses the investment or the effort that we put in or not. And we trust him. He's sovereign. But yes, it is critical that we are working as if unto the Lord in all areas of our life. And that includes our work. I do want to raise up young men, the boys in my house, especially to be able to be providers for their family members, to lead their families well, and to be hardworking and to have talents that are, of value in the workplace. So I'm going to say that, yes, when I was in the Richmond area, was working diligently, God was blessing that work. A big component of my work is relational, is impactful with people, serving vulnerable populations, again, helping people to serve and not be served. And so a lot of what I do work wise aligns with my personal biblical values. And so, first of all, finding a job opportunity that allows you to stand behind the work that you're doing with a sense of, hey, this aligns with my goals for ministering. Secondly, I want to make sure that we're being careful not to say, well, in your early years, just give it all you've got and just be a nose to the grindstone. And who cares if your young wife, you're not caring as much for her or being negligent in that area, because it'll all pay off in the long run. And that's not the case. So I want to be very clear in saying it's important to set clear boundaries and to be working in a way that still allows for one to be responsible as a Christian and your priorities to God, to your church, to your other church family members, as well as I've mentioned, as a husband. But yes, I do believe that if we are using our time wisely, if we're being purposeful in our work environment, or for Unbound students in the process of gaining skills, that it does open additional doors. And even though in my case, it was an instance where my current employer said, hey, Brian, we don't want to lose you. You're very impactful in the work that you're doing. Hey, if it would be helpful in some way for you to be in a different location that would allow for all the other aspects of your life and have a work-life balance that is, works for you, they were willing to help me with that. But I want to say for the others to say, that would never happen at my company, or my business or industry is so different. I want to let you know that I've seen individuals who have been wise with their time, or utilizing what God has given them well, that doors of opportunity have opened up that have been very surprising from outside of their work environment, through their networks and through their mentioning to others, hey, this is where I'm at. This is what I believe God has for me going forward. And can you help me find a way to meld these two together? And so being hardworking and making sure that we're using our time wisely is certainly very impactful for that.
Well, thanks. As we wind down here, I'm going to ask you the impossible question. And it's always fun as a host to be able to throw this on somebody else. But, 8 children ranging in age from early 20s down from there to how old's your youngest? That'd
Yep.
be
He's 8 years old.
8. Okay, I'm off. So 8 years old. So 8 to early 20s. That's an awful lot of parenting experience. That's a lot of parenting experiences. And so, you've got 2 audiences here. We've talked primarily to maybe our parent audience, but we've got young people listening to this. They're going to be parents at some point, likely in their lives. What would be if you had to boil that down and say, hey, I'm going to give you 1, 2, 3 things that would be the most helpful that I wish, looking back on this, I'd known it beforehand, it would help guide me better. What would that be? And I gave you the option of 1, 2, 3, because if you asked me, I'd automatically make it 3 instead of just 1. So I'll
Sure.
give you
Yeah.
some options.
Well, I want to say that our family is very thankful to be coming with a Christian heritage on both sides. So we've started with a really wonderful foundation where both sides of grandparents have sought to honor the Lord in their raising of us, Amy and I, as parents. So that's a huge help. Not everybody has that, but if you did not have that, you can certainly begin that for the next generation. And so just want to say that that's a key, making sure that everything that we're doing is grounded in God's word. And if you're the first generation to make that commitment, to do that to benefit your own children and your grandchildren from there. So that's a foundational aspect. I will say that we do as a family attempt to come together every morning for morning devotions and every evening for family worship, where we are walking through God's word and attempting to hear from his word what he has to share with us that day and be reminded of the impact that we can make while being ambassadors of Christ. A second thing that I think is important is to make sure that you're prepared for challenges. And I don't know any other way to say it. And that as we have walked through the parenting of the earliest newborns up to, as you mentioned, early 20s, that it is surprising to us, even now, of different challenges and things that come up that we say, oh, I thought we would, never experience this or never have to go through this. So back to your preparation and where to invest time now as young moms and young dads, I really think it's important to walk through the issues and topics of conflict and discipline and care and love. And what does it mean to parent in a grace-based way? Because as you and I both know, there are no perfect children and our experiences are all different in terms of what we're wrestling through and decisions to make. And each child is different. But one of the things that we've written down as we talk as a family is that as we are walking through the goals that God has given to each of us, and as we're attempting to be ambassadors, we recognize the endeavor will be challenging, yet we believe that Christ will give us the strength to accomplish his purposes. That no matter what we're going through, Christ is sufficient. And a third component, just to wrap it up, I'll say that being a part of a community that shares that commitment to doing it God's way is so important. Obviously, our church family is our number one that's helping us walk through life lessons, the challenges, and understanding of what it means to be in fellowship with other believers and to work together as we're experiencing all that life has to throw at us. And I want to say that Unbound does a remarkable job in helping us disciple our children, helping them to be focused with, issues like entrepreneurship, leadership, the sense of community. And I'm just so thankful that Unbound also points children back to the home in a sense of, hey, we're not pulling you out of your house for 4 years to go thousands of miles away to become encumbered by debt and to kind of forget about your upbringing and that which has been a part of your initial, community. But we're going to take you away from that for a time. I just really have seen that Unbound's perspective of how can we make sure that each of these students is engaging in family life, community life, church life, and maintaining those priorities through the educational process to gain the resources, talents, and skills needed to carry out God's purposes going forward. So those are some of the key things that we have attempted to incorporate. And we're thankful for Unbound's willingness to come alongside and to strengthen that approach and to make sure that our children are continuing in the path and also being encouraged by others and encouraging others as part of that community.
Well, thank you, Brian. I think in so many ways you embody this amount of ideal of being extraordinary at ordinary things. And in doing so, watching what would otherwise be ordinary become extraordinary. And that's not just a play on words. I think as we end this, I'd just like to offer a word of encouragement to those who are listening. If you're a parent and you're listening to this, just a word of encouragement. And I might also say that Brian has embodied this. You cannot be anywhere close to Brian Jacks without being welcomed into a community. And that's what happened to me. I found out about him because Brian and I ran across each other at a conference, and that would be where it ended. And I will just confess that if it had been up to me, that's where it would have ended. But Brian didn't just settle for that. He said, hey, come to my house. And he made it possible to be more and to do more. And then all of a sudden I found myself part of multiple communities I hadn't been a part of before that have just, blessed me in so many different ways. And so, if you're a parent listening to this, first of all, just a word of encouragement. Second, to maybe be like Brian and that, look for those to welcome in and then realize what a big deal that is. And then if you're a student, there's a deep desire and we try to sort of impress this through Unbound. It's not always the right vehicle to do this. And so this is an opportunity to say so. there's all kinds of ways that God can call you to serve. And so it's not one way. And so don't listen to this and think this is the ideal or something. But it is true statistically that most of us will have families and will raise children. And because that's true statistically, the temptation is to think that that is mundane or normal. And I would just say that Brian is the most unnormal person that I know, and I would say that in a positive, complimentary fashion. And if you have that desire too, say, I don't want to be like everybody else. Just know there's a way to do this family thing. There's a way to parent. There's a way to lead your family. There's a way to parent your children, to love your wife that is not normal. And if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to learn, if you're willing to press into and to lean into that, the rewards are far greater than I think I ever could have imagined. And I'm sitting at a unique part of life where, I've got a span of children of different ages. And, there were times early on where it just seemed like so much work and trying to chase all those little ones around and try to figure it out. And today, I just feel like a day doesn't go by when I'm just flabbergasted and astounded by the blessings that are flowing out of some of those older children and younger children, and things that I think are way past anything I ever deserved, and how God has graciously allowed my mistakes to not be so bad, and has taken the things that I've done marginally well, multiplied them beyond my imagining. And so thank you, Brian, for sharing from your perspective. And I hope this podcast serves as, excuse me, as a word of encouragement for those who are in the middle of it and those who might be there at some point in the future. And really appreciate your continued friendship, the example you've set, and for the way you have trained your children, especially the ones that continue to make Unbound do what they do every day. So thank you so much.
Amen. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Brian Jacks. I certainly always learn from and enjoy being with Brian. And I think, as I said in the intro, his enthusiasm is contagious. And so you can't be around Brian without getting excited about whatever Brian's excited about. And so that's a fun place to be.
Yeah.
So Brian, David, do you have any additional thoughts on our conversation?
Yeah, I think it was just very interesting. I didn't end up contributing a whole lot to the conversation, mostly because I don't really have any direct experience in parenting, but an observation that I had through multiple points that you and Brian made throughout the podcast is we talk about in Unbound that 3 of the most important things that you can manage and be good at in life are your time, your tasks, and your relationships. And I think we really hold up the relationships part is that if you don't manage your time and your task in the context of relationships and being a part of community, then those things don't matter nearly as much. That is an essential piece. And I think that hearing this conversation, I was thinking about that and how really he was presenting that his relationship with his family, as well as his relationship with outside people, whether that be his coworkers, his community, whoever else he might be involved with, really shapes how he goes about life. It very much seems like he is someone who is relationally focused and really grasps that understanding of the importance of building a worthwhile life of investing in the relationships that are important.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent summary, David. And that's very much what Ryan is about in so many ways. And he sets such a good example. And, and just to kind of loop around to our extraordinary thing, I'm just telling you that it's not that when we say extraordinary or ordinary, we don't mean people that have some measure of fame. And certainly we're not talking about people that don't have some measure of expertise and ability. It's not mundane we're looking at. We're looking at the fact that these are people that are not world renowned and not, fabulously headline, rich, famous, or powerful. And yet, they're the people that really do make the world go round. And that is really the case for somebody like Brian Jacks in terms of his family, in terms of his community, and his church, and the people he interacts with. And I can just say this as somebody who's in Brian's orbit. He has substantially and significantly changed my life in very many positive ways. He's inspired me. He's taught me. He's involved me in things I wouldn't have been involved with otherwise. He's pressed me to do things I wouldn't have done. And those have been good things. Those are challenges that were good things for me. He has connected me to people that I wouldn't have been connected with. And he did that all selflessly with no expectation of a return in ways that changed my life and changed the life of my children and then changed the life of his children and then changed the lives of my children. I mean, so, and that kind of like, it's ordinary, but yet Brian is extraordinary at the way he does that. Just pick any aspect of day-to-day stuff, being a parent, being a husband, being in the community, being in the church, working. All those things sound really ordinary, and yet here's somebody who has been extraordinary at doing those things. And in response, in return, he lives what many people consider to be an extraordinary life. And you can measure that a couple different ways. But it's pretty tough to stand close to the Jacks family. And look, we're not saying the Jacks family is perfect any more than we're saying the Brush family or the Rethemeyer family is perfect. That's not the case at all. But at the same time, you can recognize a tree by its fruit, right? And you can stand close to the Jacks family and say, that looks like a group of people just having some fun. Not perfect, not that they don't have their problems, and not that they don't have things to learn and that they don't make mistakes like all the rest of us do. But on the balance, yeah, that's a place that's pretty interesting and looks different from everything else. And I think that's kind of what we're pointing at. So, well, Brian was gracious in responding or mentioning Unbound several times, and specifically when he says Unbound, he means our Ascend program. And so we would be remiss as we finish up here that we wouldn't kind of tag on and touch on some of those things. Brian mentioned that one of the things about the Ascend program, and indeed all of Unbound's programs, is that we really are committed to allowing students to remain embedded in local communities. And that means their families, and that means their local churches and communities, things of that nature. We really do think that wherever you live, you've built up relational capital there. And that while you can walk away from that, and there's certainly places and times when God calls you to do that, and that's the right thing to do. And we're not saying it's wrong to do those things. It's also an advantage to have that relational capital, and you should leave it reluctantly. And so we want to provide an educational process and an educational system that allows you to gain from a national network of high-performing, extraordinary and ordinary type people while being embedded in local communities where you have relational capital and where you can continue to be a part of your families and a part of your churches and a part of your neighborhoods and continue to serve there and to learn there and to build relationships with those people. And so at the heart of what we do and everything that we do at Unbound is this idea that we want to connect you to a national network and allow you to stay local at the same time. So you can bring those national network advantages to your local situation. And so that's a big part of what we do in Ascend. And if you're interested in Ascend, or if you're interested in anything that Unbound does, definitely check us out at beunbound.us. You can schedule an appointment to talk to us and learn more about our programs. You can go to the website. You can read the blog. You're obviously listening to the podcast, which we appreciate. You can see us visually if you go to Be Unbound on YouTube. And you can find us on all, of course, the social media platforms. But we'll be delighted to have you learn more about us. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us. And we hope that this conversation was a blessing for you today. Until next time, be unbound.